Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Side by Side Digital. I'm your host, Rebecca Shively. We've got a great program lined up for you today. This month, we're talking about farm lease types. This is a topic we've gotten a lot of requests for, and we know it can be confusing to know what kind of agreement works best for you and your operation. We're joined today by Dr. Michael Langemeier, Professor of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University and Associate Director of Purdue's Center for Commercial Agriculture. He's going to walk us through different lease structures and give us some tips on how to think through what's best for you and your operation. Dr. Langemeier, thanks for joining us today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Glad to be here. This is a topic that I address quite a bit with extension audiences, and in particular, I've helped quite a few people with flex leases. They're certainly not for everybody, but we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of flex leases, as well as talking about cash rent leases and share rent leases. And then if I have time, towards the end, I'll give you my thoughts of where cash rents and land values may be going here in the next 1 to 2 years. Let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, I call this Ag Leasing 101. I did that for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is somewhat of an introductory topic, introductory discussion of these topics, but we can get into more detail in your question and answers. That's certainly possible. But there's also a website called Ag Lease 101 that you may want to take a look at, particularly if you're interested in looking at some sample forms for cash rent, share rent, and flex leases, as well as pasture leases. And I think there's also some at least information related to irrigation on that website. So take a look at that. Also, as was indicated, I'm part of the Center for Commercial Agriculture. We also have quite a bit of information related to leases, cash rents, and land values on our website. Of course, our website is designed to be helpful for everybody, but we are located in the Eastern Corn Belt, so keep that in mind. Things are a little different in Indiana compared to where I grew up in Nebraska. I mean, the leasing principles are the same, but certainly there's some of the ins and outs and prevalence of different types of leases is different depending on where you're at in the Corn Belt. So I do want to talk about different types of leases real briefly, and then I'm going to go through a discussion of that compares cash rent, flex rent, and share rent comparisons. I'm doing that using a case farm in Indiana, and I realize that that's very state dependent. But I do think some of the themes I'm going to talk about when I make these comparisons, such as who shares the risk and how much risk is shared with the, how is risk shared across these different lease arrangements, will become very evident in my comparisons of cash rent, flex rent, and share rent, and you'll begin to see where the flex rent might fit in with those comparisons. And then, as I indicated, if I have time, I'm going to talk about what I call the cash rent dilemma. Here's the potential dilemma that we might be facing. It's similar to the situation we perhaps some of you were facing in 2013 and 2014. We were coming off in 2013, 2014. We were coming off several strong years of net return to land, and the question was, if net return to land does drop, which it did from 2014 to 2019, how can we negotiate changes to our cash rent? Specifically, if it's necessary, how can we negotiate a downward adjustment to cash rent? Well, we're coming off right now 2 pretty good years overall. I know this is not true everywhere, and it's quite different depending on where you're at across the Corn Belt. But we're coming off some 3 pretty strong years in terms of net crop returns. 2020, 21, and 22. 23 is not too bad, but it's certainly not as good as the previous 3. And if you look at corn prices going out into 24, they're closer to $5 than they are to $6 or above $6. And so we may be in an environment where we're in that same cash rent dilemma in 24 that we were back in 2014. And so that's why I'm calling it the cash rent dilemma. So if we look at types of leases, I'm keeping this fairly basic, and then we can address more detail in questions. And these webinars are much more productive if you ask questions. So I'm looking at the question and answer button down there, and I think it's going to tell me the number of questions. And so hopefully you'll think of some questions as I'm going through this. And they don't have to be focused on flex rent. They can be focused on other lease types. We'll start with a crop share lease. Historically, this was the primary lease across the Corn Belt, particularly in the Eastern Corn Belt. Here, it's a lot less common. We've moved more towards the cash rent and flex rent leases because the landowner simply did not want to share as much of the risk as you share with a crop share lease. And the reason why there's more risk with the crop share lease is the tenant and landowner share some of the input costs, and so there is that uncertainty or variability in input costs. Think about fertilizer here. The last couple years, it increased rather dramatically in 22 compared to 2021. It's fairly high in 23, and it looks like it might be lower in 24. Well, that's a risk to the landowner if they're paying some of that fertilizer bill. And seed and chemicals is in a similar situation, particularly post-COVID. Chemical costs were relatively high. Well, that's a risk to the landowner, and so that's what I mean when they're sharing more risk, or more risk is shared, or the landowner has more risk under these crop share lease arrangements. Under this arrangement, landowner pays land ownership costs, and so if there's any improvements that need to be made, they're responsible for those. They're responsible for the real estate taxes and those kinds of costs too. The tenant pays the remaining costs, the costs that are not land ownership costs, and typically seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. It doesn't necessarily have to be seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. I know as you go further west, not all of those three are included in crop share leases. But in a lot of leases in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, and Ohio, that seed, fertilizer, and chemical is typically shared. The other source of risk for the landowner is you share the revenue. That's really good in years like 21 and 22, but think about years like 2019, for example, or 2015. We're going to see a chart of this in a little bit, looking at different landowner net returns, and there's some years during that 14 to 19 period where their income per acre was relatively low with this crop share lease because we're sharing the price and yield risk. And in my experience, we still have quite a few landowners that are former farmers that want to use the crop share lease, and that's not all the landowners that use it, but that group in particular seems to like the crop share lease. And then as you move further west, they do become more common. They're pretty common. They're more common in Nebraska and Kansas than they certainly are here in Indiana in the Eastern Corn Belt. So that's kind of our historical standard, the crop share lease, and obviously the shares vary. They're more 50-50 in the Eastern Corn Belt here. And as you go all the way to Western Nebraska, they're more 1/3, 2/3, maybe 40-60 in Eastern Nebraska, or 50-50, depending on exactly what type of land it is. And so that share does change depending on where you're at in the Corn Belt. But that's the basic idea, as we're sharing some of the costs and we're sharing the revenue. The cash lease. A lot of landowners really like this because they know exactly what they're going to get. We have a lot of 1-year leases, and so they know exactly what they're going to get for 1 year. That doesn't mean that's going to be the same 2, 3, 4 years out, but at least for that year, they know what they're going to get in terms of cash rent. And that's very attractive, particularly for landowners that are retired and which a lot of landowners are, and they like that fact that they know what that revenue is going to be. In this case, the tenant pays all operating costs. The landowner pays all land ownership costs, which are primarily real estate taxes. But if there is some improvements that need to be made, the landowner either needs to pay for those, or to come into some kind of agreement. We're going to adjust rent, and the operator and landowner pay those together. And we can talk about situations like that if you want to. For example, tile drainage. How do we pay for tile drainage on rented ground? I've got some thoughts there, not perfect thoughts by any means, or not the answer, but I have some thoughts on how that can be done. In this case, the operator, the tenant, receives all revenue, crop government payments, and crop insurance indemnity payments. So it's less record keeping for them in terms of the revenue. And the landowner, as I said, receives a fixed rental amount. The tenant takes all price and yield risk. The reason why the flex rents came about, and they've been around for a while, but they've become more prevalent the last few years, is sometimes sometimes a landowner, they see these increases in crop prices. Maybe they see these high yields and they say, boy, I wish I could take advantage of that. At the same time, they like the fact that the flex leases, which I'm going to get to next, the fact that the flex leases have more of a safety net than the share leases, particularly the flex lease that I'm going to talk about. It has a base rent. And so you know you're not going to get as much as the fixed cash rent lease in terms of a base payment typically, but you know in years where the yields are really high or the price is really high or both, like we saw in 21 and 22, a lot of places, that some of that revenue is going to be shared with the landowner. And so I'm talking about this from the landowner perspective, but you can just flip it around and you can think about it from the operator perspective. And so I can see why some landowners find these appealing. And so let's look at the little difference here, and then we'll make some comparisons between the three different types of leases. I should say, first of all, that there's a lot of different flexible cash leases. When I was talking about this topic maybe 15 years ago, I was at Kansas State. At that time, I moved to Purdue about 11 years ago. But when we were talking about flex leases in Kansas State, and I'm sure it was true here at Purdue, we were talking about leases that flex on yield and price. It's become more common, though they're still around, leases that flex on yield or price, and it's usually one or the other. It's much more common now to flex on revenue. And so my discussion is going to focus on flex leases that focus on revenue, and I'll get more specific here in the next couple of slides. But here the tenant pays all operating costs, just like a cash lease. Landowner pays all land ownership costs, just like a cash lease. Tenant receives all the revenue. That's initially before we pay any bonuses. So tenant receives all the revenue from the three different sources. And then here, some of that revenue is going to be shared. And I'm getting into that in the last point here. The rent is going to vary depending on the price, yield, or gross revenue. And as I indicated, it's typical now to vary depending on the gross revenue. And so the way these typically work is you have a base cash rent. The example I'm going to talk about is a 90% base. And so the base is 10% below the market cash rent. And then if certain conditions hold, i.e. high gross revenue, that revenue above a certain threshold, and there's many ways to come up with that threshold, but that revenue above the threshold is shared. And so, like I said, if it looks like we hit a home run, we have good prices, we have good yields, then some of that high revenue is shared with the landlord. I really view flexible leases as kind of a combination or an in-between between share leases and cash rent leases. The flex leases have a nice feature in that they do have that floor, where share leases don't have a floor necessarily. It's a pretty low net income from a landowner's standpoint with a share lease if you have a really poor crop and you have low crop insurance coverage level. But with these flex leases, there's a floor there, and then in really good years, you do get to take it. You do get a higher income. At least some of the extra revenue, if you will, above that threshold is shared with a landowner. And so let's move on here with these comparisons. I think that'll bring home some of the points I made a little bit more. So in this case, I've got estimated landowner net returns. So again, the landowner perspective. I'm using a case farm example in West Central Indiana. It's a 3,000 acre farm that's 50% corn and 50% soybeans. So that would be very typical for this part of the world. This year we planted 50% corn and 50% soybeans in Indiana. So very little continuous corn or continuous soybeans for that matter. So we have estimated landowner returns from 2007 to 2023. The 2023 obviously is projected. Why did I start with 2007? I wanted to start at the beginning of the ethanol boom. We certainly have a difference in prices, 2007 forward versus pre-2007. And so I wanted to start with 2007 in these comparisons. I've also done work going all the way back into the early 90s. It doesn't substantially change the information I'm going to share. But we're comparing the net returns from three leases: crop share lease, fixed cash lease, and flexible cash lease. And I'll get into the details here of those leases in the next couple of slides. So first of all, the crop share, This is very standard here. Landowner pays 50% of seed, fertilizer, chemical, and crop insurance costs. Typically, the landowner buys their own crop insurance, but in this example, I'm assuming they have the same coverage level as the operator. And so I realize that they don't buy crop insurance together. That's what I'm assuming here. The landowner receives 50% of all revenue. Notice I say all revenue. This can be done differently. It would just change. I might have to change the features of the lease a little bit if this wasn't the case. And so government payments and crop insurance indemnity payments are shared. Again, the landowner probably has his own crop insurance, so he's going to get his share of those, and the government payments are shared, which is fairly typical with crop share leases. There's also a fixed cash lease that doesn't need to be explained anymore, and those are 1-year leases. The fixed cash lease in this case is a 1-year lease, which again is very typical for where I'm sitting here today. The flex lease is a very specific flex lease, and so if you have any questions about this, just let me know when we address questions. The base rent is set at 90% of the fixed cash lease. And so if the market cash rent in an area is $300 per acre, the base rent for this flex lease would be $270. And so there's going to be years where you're going to get less net income from a landowner perspective with this flexible lease, because there's going to be years where you don't get a bonus. And I'll show that. I'll illustrate that here using 2007 to 2023 data. In this case, and again, these thresholds can be set up various ways. Long-term average crop gross revenue. I mean, there's various ways to do this. This is the way I like to think about it. And I know not everybody does this, but I know there's a few people do this. Landowner receives as a bonus 50% of corn and soybean revenue above non-land cost plus base rent. And so we take something like the Purdue crop cost budget. We look at all the costs, exclude the cash rent from the budget, and we add to all those costs. This would be variable and fixed costs. We add to those costs the base rent. So in my previous example, it's $300 market rent. We don't use $300 here to calculate the non-land cost. We use $270. So all the other costs plus $270. Right away, for those of you that remember Ag Econ 101 or Econ 101, remember the difference between cash and opportunity cost? We're including all of those in here. And so when I say cost, I'm not just talking about the variable costs, including seed, fertilizer, those kinds of things. Because I'm referring to a budget here, we also have an opportunity cost associated with owning machinery. We have an opportunity cost associated with operator labor. And so this is very much a full costing. And so you can see here, the threshold here is relatively high. You have to have a pretty strong price and or strong yield in order to get a bonus here. I've seen some arrangements where the threshold's not as high and the bonuses are paid more frequently. But quite frankly, if you change this bonus, you have to change that fixed cash lease. If the bonuses are more frequent, you typically have to use a lower base rent. I've done one example, not in these slides, but I've done one example where I have a 75% base rent, but you get bonuses pretty much every year. I kind of like this, that you get a little lower cash rent in years where the revenue is below the threshold, but you share a pretty large portion of that revenue above costs in good years like 21 and 22. And so I'm just justifying why I looked at this particular type of lease. One other thing I would want to point out, I'd be remiss if I didn't. There's a long time ago, and I see a few of these around still. We had shared leases in Indiana, and I know these were common in other states, but the shares probably were a little different. We had shared leases in Indiana where there was basically a 1/3, 2/3. Where you go back to that crop share lease that's 50-50, rather than sharing those expenses, we don't share any expenses. And we just get 1/3 of the revenue. That works quite well long-term in Indiana and is very comparable in terms of net income to all these other leases. And so, like I said, there's 100 different types of leases that we could talk about. I'm just trying to focus on what I think are some fairly common, fairly straightforward leases. Now, another problem with the flex lease that you have to think about, and I said at the beginning, these are not for everybody. The reason why they're not for everybody is I've left a lot a lot to the imagination here in terms of the specifics to the flex lease. For example, somehow you have to validate the crop yield. I suppose with monitors and other things, scale, tickets, things like that, that you can accomplish that. You have to do that with a share lease too, so maybe that's not that big a deal. The other thing that's really, really important is how do you determine price? You have to come to some kind of agreement between the landlord and the operator on how you determine price. I've seen all kinds of examples here. You want to keep it relatively simple. Something like we're going to take crop prices in the first week of December for corn and soybeans at a specific elevator or at a specific ethanol plant. Whatever the average was for that week, we're going to use those for the prices to calculate the bonus. I think using the harvest price for crop insurance is probably, some people use that, but some people don't like that because remember, crop insurance harvest price is a futures price. It's preferable here, particularly in areas where the basis is pretty wide. It's preferable typically to use a cash price rather than a futures price, to settle these. But I don't want to make light of the fact that has to be settled. That is very important to settle that. I see I have a question here, and I'm going to get through this example, and then I will take a look at that question, pause for questions. And so let's take a look at some charts related to these three. Well, I have an example of the flex lease first, so let's go through that. I picked 2 years where we had some bonuses. 2020 was a pretty good year, so we have a base rent of 227 given our market cash rent of 252. We have a non-land cost plus base rent. This is an average for corn and soybeans. That's why some of those corn producers say, well, that's really low cost. This is an average of the two in 2020 before we saw these large increases in input costs. The revenue was 786. I used kind of a weighted average price to come up with this revenue of 786. And so in this case, the revenue was above the non-land cost plus base rent. We share that. And so the landowner got $227 plus $52 bonus. And again, the non-land cost was based on some kind of crop budget, if you will. You can say, well, I have better costs in the crop budget. Well, if you can agree that you're going to use a farm specific cost, by all means do that. The reason why I refer to a crop budget, that's something that's published. And so the simpler you can make these, the better off you're going to be. You don't want to lose a farm because both parties did not understand the provisions of the flexible cash lease. You don't want to lose a farm over that. So you need to be very clear on how these bonuses are going to be paid. The 2023, this is my projection. It could turn out to no bonus in a heartbeat here because price seems to be fluctuating around and we don't know what the yields are going to be yet. So the base rent here is 251. Our cash rent was 278 for this case farm in northwest Indiana, right by Tippecanoe here, where Purdue is located. That's for average productivity land. Our high productivity would be well over 300. With a base rent of 251, 90% of the cash rent. The non-land cost and base rent is substantially higher. Again, this is an average of corn and soybeans, so $908 in this case. So it's a bigger threshold. The cost went up. We have a bigger threshold we have to meet in terms of the revenue. Estimated revenue, with price projections and estimated yields, is $918. And so it appears in 23, we might get a small bonus. But like I said, that could disappear here if price is a little bit lower or yields a little bit lower than my projections here. I did these projections just a few days ago. So let's take a look here at some charts, kind of look at the risk sharing, and then we'll address some questions related to these three different types of lease. And so this is comparing crop share and fixed cash rent. Notice here, crop share hits home run in some years. And so 2007, 2008, 2010, 11, 12, returns were pretty high for that crop share lease. Again, in 2021 and 22, particularly 21, crop share lease did extremely well. But look at 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, basically that 14 to 19 period, the crop share net returns were lower because we're sharing the risk in this case. We had lower prices, and we in some of those years, the yield was not trend. I'm using typical yields for this area in my computations here, and particularly 15, we didn't have very good yields here, and so that certainly took that crop share lease rent payment way below the average, to the tune of over $100. And so see the inherent risk associated with using a crop share lease, even in Indiana. I know some of you in the Western Corn Belt, well, it'd be much more variable than this, and you're right. There would be a lot more risk. That's why often risk is shared when you get into Nebraska and Kansas, because there is so much more risk. But even in Indiana, more predictable rainfall than what you have in the Western Corn Belt, there's a lot of risk associated with a crop share lease. And so you can see why some landowners would rather have fixed cash rent. It moves around, but it doesn't move around as much as the crop share lease. Now let's take a look at the flexible cash. It looks similar to the crop share. However, it has some upside, just like the crop share. The upside's not quite as big as it was for the crop share. But notice here, in some of those down years during that 14 to 19 period, that line's not going as far down. There was a year in crop share where the net return was $150. Well, in this case, we only go down to that base rent, and so that downside is chopped off with this flex. So you can see why this is attractive to some landowners. Is I get protected, and I realize I'm going to get a lower cash rent in these low gross revenue years, but years like 21, I'm going to get a pretty large bonus. Rather than getting in this case $260 cash rent, I'm going to get cash rent $375, and so I'm going to get a $100 over $100 per acre bonus. And again, this is corn and soybeans. Corn would be a larger bonus in 21 compared to just the average of the two. And so I can see why people like this flex lease. This is a very important slide, because this is kind of a busy slide, but it really does a nice job of comparing the flexible and fixed lease and the share and fixed lease. And so the share minus the fixed lease is the line. And so when the line is negative, that means the share lease has lower returns than the fixed cash lease. Again, I point out that 15 was really bad. We had lower yield, and the price wasn't very good either. And so the share lease was very low income compared to the cash rent lease. And then, of course, when the line's above zero, that means the share lease did better than the fixed lease. And I should say, over time, the net return for these three leases is very similar. And so the average is fairly similar. And so I should say that. But the flexible minus fixed, let's take a look at that. That's the bars. In good revenue years, 7, 10, 11, 12, the flex lease does better, just like the share lease. And then also in 20, 21, 22, the flex lease does better. But look at these years, some of these years from 14 to 19. Notice there that the bar kind of stops. It kind of hits a safety net there of maybe approximately $25, $30. That's 10%. You give up 10% of the market cash rent, and that's what we're calling the base rent. And so see how it chops off that downside risk. And so again, this lease is for those that really want some of the features of that fixed cash lease. I want a certain amount of money for sure, with no uncertainty about it, but I want to hit a home run in these good years like 21. I want to be able to have share some of that good gross revenue in 21. So and so that this is a pretty important slide. And I can share these with anybody. I mean, the Farm Credit people are willing to, they can share these slides, post them, whatever, but they'd also be available for me. In fact, I'm going to try to post these to the Center for Commercial Agriculture website. And so I'm also working on a Farm Doc Daily article that has some of the same information that I hope to publish in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'll update the 23 data and go ahead and publish that for those of you that follow the Farm Doc Daily. But this slide does a good job of really contrasting the flexible lease with the share lease as well as the fixed lease. And so bonuses, this particular arrangement does not have as large of bonuses as some of those I've been hearing. I've heard of flex leases with bonuses $200, $300. I guarantee you their base rent's not the same as what I'm talking about here. And their threshold is different. I'm using a more cost-based threshold here. But nevertheless, a lot of these years you did get a bonus. The average return's similar. for the fixed cash and the flex lease. But there was quite a few years here where you did get a bonus. A lot of times the bonus is relatively small, but you got some years here in 21 where the bonus was about $140, and you got some years 10, 11 where it was close to $100. And so, as we used to say, that's not chicken feed. The chicken feed is kind of expensive today. That's an old saying. But you get some pretty good bonuses with this arrangement. And so before I get into the cash rent dilemma, let me take a real quick look at the chat here. That's just a housekeeping one. Let me take a look at the question and answer. I'm going to go ahead and read this, and I'll go ahead and answer it. I rent my farm on a guaranteed bushel basis. I get X amount of corn delivered to a facility within a 50-mile radius of my farm. I can market my corn as I see fit. I have price risk, but not production risk. The renter has no cash output, so his balance sheet remains stronger. Has worked very well for me. Yes, this I think would be similar to the one-third, 2/3. Kind of a spin-off of that is bushels. I'm going to have so many bushels, that the landlord's going to receive, and they can go ahead and market that crop they want. Sometimes they want some help with the operator marketing that crop, so that transparency needs to be there in terms of how that crop compares. But yeah, this is very similar to that 1/3, 2/3. And so, as I said, there's various ways of doing these leases. Any other questions, particularly on the flex lease? Otherwise, I will get into my my spiel about where cash rents and land values may be heading. Do not be shy. This is one professor where it's not real hard to stump, but I'll tell you I'm stumped. Okay. There'll be another chance for questions here later on. You're still thinking of one. So before I get into that, this is India specific, but this is something to think about if you're thinking about these different leasing arrangements, particularly if you're doing the bushel rent like the question asked. But if you're thinking about this 1/3, 2/3, how did we come about with these lease shares? How do these come about? Well, typically what we do, this is looking at a snapshot of a recent cost share. You look at long run cost shares. How much of the total cost, now this is cash and opportunity cost, just like a cost budget would be in Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio State. All these land-grant universities have crop budgets. They all look somewhat similar. I wish they looked identical, but they don't. But they look somewhat similar. But they do include cost and opportunity costs, and so this does include that. So notice there's machinery costs here and labor costs, and those are opportunity costs. So they don't depend on the amount borrowed for a particular farm. But if for corn, looking at the shares, it's typically from 25 to 30%. Recently, it's been 27%. So 27% of the cost is cash rent. So if you were doing continuous corn, the 1/3, 2/3 would probably be a little too high a rent. That'd be a little bit too much for the landowner because cash rent over time is only 27% of the cost. But I'm assuming a corn soybean rotation. If you go to soybeans do not have the high nitrogen costs. There's other costs there's other costs that are also not as high for soybeans as they are for corn. Labor costs, for example, is not as high. But you just go on and on down the budget. There's quite a few costs that are lower for soybeans compared to corn. Soybeans is 38%, and so if you average those two together, you come right about 1/3, 2/3. So that's why that works. That's how we got the 50-50. Sharing certain costs. Those come out over a long period of time as being advantageous to both parties. And so that's where we're getting the shares. I've got a question here. I'm going to go ahead and look at the question before we continue. What is the prevalent lease type in the Dakotas? I'm not exactly sure what the answer to that is, but my guess is, and we don't have good information on the distribution of leases for for most states, Iowa probably has the best because they do actually do a survey. My guess in the Dakota is you're going to see more share leases than you're going to see out here in my part of the world, simply because there's more risk. And the share leases wouldn't necessarily be 50-50. There could be some 40-60 up there, and not sharing all three of those expenses. And so that's just my hunch, not seeing any survey data coming from the Dakotas. That tends to be the case in states I'm more familiar with, Nebraska and Kansas. I don't see why the Dakotas would be that much different than Nebraska and Kansas. There's just more risk to share. Do you put a cap maximum on the flex lease bonus? If so, how do you determine that cap? With my particular threshold, you really don't need a cap because the threshold is pretty high. Even in 21, which was the best net return for this case farm since 73. So even in 21, the bonus was still $150. Now I have seen different thresholds that, particularly the threshold is lower. I think with those, even with a lower base, you might need a cap. And I don't exactly know how you would set that cap. But if you use logic here and do some backcasting like I've done, you probably want to chop out years where the bonus is 200 plus. I'm kind of sticking my neck out here a little bit, but that seems to me to be, if you're starting to talk about cash rent that's double, that seems to me to be an outlier, and you'd put some kind of cap on it. The 40-60 crop share leases, well, those vary a little bit in terms of what they include, but a lot of the 40-60 leases probably won't include corn, fertilizer, and chemicals. They might be just corn and fertilizer. That's been my experience. Except when you get out to western Nebraska, in that territory, that's 1/3, 2/3, and includes fertilizer. And a couple ag economists in Nebraska have a good land value survey. And in that survey, or as a spinoff, they also have some of the costs that are shared. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at that. But in my experience, the 40-60 typically doesn't share all three of those costs. It's just seed and fertilizer. And why lower than the 50-50? Well, a different part of the world, the revenue's different. And so that's why I showed you that cost share. When you go to different parts of the Corn Belt, that the cost share varies, but also the revenue potential varies. And so that's why just because the 50-50 is used here does not mean a 50-50 would work in Nebraska. Now, when you go into irrigated ground in Nebraska and Kansas, that does tend to be 50-50. And so it really depends on the type of ground you're looking at it and where you're at. Good questions. Keep them coming. Looking at cash rent net return to land for West Central Indiana, I guess, again, for this case farm, this is dollars per acre. And first thing you notice here, and this is true everywhere, not just Indiana, net return to land is considerably more variable than cash rents. And that's the way it should be from a landlord perspective and even from an operator perspective. If these one-year leases, who wants to negotiate a $100 to $150 change in cash rent every year? That's brutal. And so rather than doing that, we slowly adjust. And so notice from 14 to 19 here, we had a pretty big drop in cash rent in Indiana here, about 15%. Now, I know some other states it was a bit larger than that, but we had about a 15% drop in cash rent. That took place over 5 years, 6 years, rather than 1 year. And so in some ways, people need to be convinced that the returns have changed to start dropping that cash rent. And you also see that's true on the upside. If you look at from 7 to 13, it took quite a few years to convince both parties that these net returns were going to stay relatively high for more than 1 year. And so it took quite a while for that cash rent to adjust upwards. So cash rent adjusts very slowly to changes in net return to land because these have to be negotiated every year. And so we negotiate relatively small changes. Now, in 23, for this particular type of land, we saw a small decline in cash rent, but That wasn't true for the entire state of Indiana. We had a slight increase in cash rent in Indiana, as well as some other states did too. But this is 23 data rather than just 22. The 22 numbers were up substantially everywhere, land values and cash rent. But here we're talking 23 numbers. But we did see a slight decline in 23 here, and now we could be in a different situation, I think, where we're coming off some very strong net return to land. If net return to land stays relatively lower, 23 is an example, but if 24 is also $200, you're probably going to see some slight downward adjustment in cash rents continue past 23. And now we're not talking huge percentage reductions, but there certainly would be a tendency for stable cash rents and declining cash rents if we see this coming. And so I'm saying for Indiana, we start negotiating 24 cash rents, which we're going to start doing that here in the near future. We're probably looking at cash rents that are stable, given that cash rents in the state of Indiana did increase 2-3%, stable to maybe some areas where they're down maybe 2-3%, like they were in 23. And so some fairly small changes in 23. Why? Because we don't know for sure whether 24 net returns look more like 23 or 20, 21, and 22. There's a lot of things going to happen. There's a lot going on around the world. If you haven't recognized that, we got geopolitical conflict in Ukraine and Russia affecting the markets. We got demand issues in different countries. Demand issues here. And there's just a lot of things happening with supply and demand that things could change very quickly. But that's kind of what my crystal ball says is fairly flat in terms of cash rent, anywhere from -2% to possibly up 2%, assuming that net returns don't crash here. And quite frankly, in 23, soybeans are helping us tremendously. Soybeans are considerably more profitable than corn right now. Given the revised acreage estimates a few weeks ago. And so we're looking at some much stronger soybean returns that are helping net return to land in this 50-50 rotation. So if we're looking at let's say we're looking at someplace, I've got a couple more minutes here, and then I'll take some more questions. If we're looking, let's say we're looking at in some areas where we're expecting net returns to be lower. And we know landowners reluctant to reduce cash rents. How should we think about this tract of land? And I know most of you have been through this before. I showed you the chart from 2007 on. I've been farmed since 2007 on. We've faced this 2 or 3 times now since 2007. But if you expect to lose money in 2024 in a tract of rented land, we're not going to cover all costs. And so there is going to be some costs that probably aren't going to be covered in 2024, with my initial budget here. So if that's the case, how much of a premium can we pay to retain control of the tract until the net return prospects improve? The answer is quite a bit, because how hard is it to get a tract back if you give it up? Very difficult. And so unless the return is substantially lower, we're probably going to hang on to that tract. What we're going to simply do is try to negotiate a lower cash rent, if not this year, maybe next year, if the net returns stay relatively low. And so that's how this typically works. But the real answer is, what does your liquidity look like? If I'm in a situation like a lot of farms are, where I have a very strong balance sheet in terms of liquidity and solvency, I can take a hit. I can take a hit for 1 or 2 years and keep this track of ground and then continue to try to negotiate a lower cash rent if these net returns are lower. And so the worst thing you can do is say, well, I'm not going to break even this year, so I'm going to give up this track of ground. We just can't think like this. We're in for the long term. We know some years we're going to have cash rents are going to seem too high compared to what we're getting from a net return to land. But you also have years like 21 where they're substantially above, and this all gets washed out over the long period of time. And so the real answer here does depend on liquidity. We do have a spreadsheet on our website that walks you through some of the things you need to think about, budgets, using the long run prices, long run yields to come up with the impact of liquidity of having a cash rent that's above your break even. Now, when I say break even, I'm including all those costs in the break even. I'm not just including cash costs. And the break even right now for Indiana for this case farm is $550. Are we going to get 550 corn this fall? It certainly doesn't look like it. And so we're not going to break even this fall. Does that mean that we give up some of our tracts of ground? Not necessarily. It depends on how much of a premium we're paying. And so I don't want to beat a dead horse there, but this can get fairly complicated. But I did want to talk about this in addition to talking about the different lease type, because this is something that farms face all the time. Is we're looking, as we go through these ups and downs, we're going to have years where it doesn't look like we're going to break even. What should we do? So let me see if I have some more questions here. But we certainly have time now. You asked me a few questions here. We certainly have time to cover some questions.
Yeah, maybe one question that might be good to touch on. So say someone's currently operating with a cash rent agreement. What's kind of your best advice on how to transition to a flex lease? So is there an ideal time of year, and kind of what steps are involved? Do I need to go get my lawyer to draw up a paper? Kind of what would your recommendation be if you want to change?
First of all, look at the form on Ag Lease 101. There's a form for both cash rent and flex lease. You'll see if that is going to be able to work for you. But the main things you need to think about is start thinking about all the different things you're going to need to do if you're going to flex lease. For example, what's the base rent going to be? Think about that. That's a very important decision. Another decision is, what is the threshold going to be? Am I going to use some kind of long run average gross revenue, or am I going to use something that's more cost based like I'm doing here? The cost base is more advantageous, I think, for the operator. That's kind of the way I suggested. It's something that makes a lot of sense from an operator perspective to use a cost-based threshold. So you need to think about the threshold. The other thing you really need to think about is, how is price going to be determined? And quite frankly, whether I used a flex lease or not would really depend on the landlord I'm dealing with. If I'm dealing with a landlord that is really not going to understand the ins and outs of production agriculture, and it's going to be very difficult to explain the threshold. It's going to be very difficult to explain, price settlement. Don't do it. But if you have a landlord, particularly if they're previously farmed, that understand some of the risk associated with agriculture, they're more amenable to this, because you can pitch it saying, yeah, I'm going to pay less cash rent in certain years, but in years like 21, you're going to get a big bonus. That's attractive to some landlords. And so I would make this very landlord specific. But before you get into that discussion with a landlord, think about those three things. What's my base? What's the threshold? And how am I going to determine price? Validating yields, you probably already do that with your landlords, and so that's probably not a big deal. But think about those things before you approach the landlord, and then be very cautious approaching certain types of landlords. I'll just be more specific. If I had a landlord in a nursing home, flex rent, no. If I had a landlord that formed 5 years ago, probably at least address it as something that might be possible for them.
Yeah, great advice though. There, you got to know your audience. It looks like a couple other questions have come in. One is around bushel rent. How are bushels determined, federal crop yield, and what percent?
I would do it more like I do that 1/3, 2/3. Think about what would be a share that makes sense for my area. Again, the 1/3, 2/3 makes sense for Indiana. I have to do some calculations for someplace else, but what makes sense for my area, and then just kind of use that. In my case, I think 1/3 of the bushels would make sense.
Gotcha. Looks like another one on here. If approaching land investor partners who want to achieve a 3 to 4% return on their purchase, how should I structure a lease so that I can meet their needs without risking long-term high cash rent prices?
The flex lease might be attractive in that case, because there is going to be some years where the return is above 3%. That's a struggle right now. That's a very good question, but it's a struggle right now because the cash rent to land value is probably sitting closer to 2.5% right now. We're at a very historically low cap rate, very low cap rate right now, and this is a problem. One of the things you have to do with the long run investors, if you're talking to those people, is I like to refer to land as something similar to a dividend paying stock. I get a dividend, which is the cash rent every year, but I get a pretty healthy capital gain, particularly over a long period of time. And for Indiana, I don't think this would be true for. I don't think this would be any different for Nebraska or Kansas, where I'm more familiar with. Over a long period of time, the capital gains larger than the cash rent, and so you need to make sure that these investors know that you're going to have 2.5% return in some of these years, but that with that cap rate, land's a very attractive investment. It has a very attractive return if you add the cash rent to the capital gain. I've had a student do some research on this, and there's a reason why institutional investors are interested in land. It has a fairly good return for the risk. We think of agriculture as risky. It's not near as risky as a tech stock, investing in a tech company, not even close to as risky as that. So the risk is not bothering these people that much. The other thing they really like is the fact that land returns are not correlated with the S&P 500. That's obvious to us in agriculture that we have a different cycle. Think 7 and 8. Those were good years for production agriculture. 2008 was awful for the U.S. economy. And so that's really attractive to an outside investor, whether they be an institutional investor or there's a lot of people in rural communities that are either retired farmers or business people that want to invest in land. We have those all over the Corn Belt. That land's also attractive for those people because of the fact that it's not correlated with other business income. That was more than you probably wanted there, but you got me on my soapbox on that one. I love that topic.
Nope, good stuff. And it looks like our listener appreciated that answer, so thank you. Let's see if we have any more questions in here. I know we're running a little low on time. Oh, one more that just came in. Landowner wants 1/3 of crop as cash rent. Is there a way to determine yield without taking it all to the elevator if I wanted to use on-farm storage for my portion?
You would have to negotiate that, but I would think with a combination of on-farm storage and yield monitor, assuming that you've validated your yield monitor, I would think for some landowners that would be sufficient. It would just depend on the landowner. Some would want those scale tickets. Others might find it acceptable to the on-farm storage and something like that. And really how the grain is, in the share leases. How the grain is stored varies tremendously. A lot of these share leases are between family members, and so a lot of times it goes to the on-farm storage, and you could probably be a little looser in terms of measuring the yield. You want to be fair. I'm not saying that, but you can be a little looser in how you estimate that yield because it's all going to the same storage facility, and it might even be marketed. By the operator. The landowner might be satisfied with having the operator help them market that crop. It can go all the way to there where you have to take every bushel to the elevator and it has to be weighed, and the landowner does all the marketing themselves, and everything else in between. So it really is landowner specific, that question.
Gotcha. Right. I'm not seeing other questions in there. I do have one more to kind of end us on. I know we have quite a few folks in the audience that are kind of young and beginning. So is there a piece of advice that you kind of carve out specifically for that demographic where maybe it's their first time taking over, handling the lease agreement? What advice do you have for young and beginning folks that might be on the call?
I wouldn't necessarily start with the flex leases because you don't have as much experience negotiating leases with landowners. I think that's something that you need to have a little experience doing that before you get complicated. And so I think the cash rent or share leases are more attractive to those. And if you can, I know there's some landowners who are not interested in the share lease. If you can, talk to your landowners about share leases because you share the risk. And so those years like 2015 here, everybody gets a lower revenue. The operator got a lower revenue, and the landowner got to operate a lower revenue. And so share leases make quite a bit of sense, for beginning operator. But certainly do your homework. Know what share leases are appropriate for your area. Ask around. What other people use, including family members. If you have some family members, and then also do your homework in terms of cash rent. I know when you're young and you want to expand very rapidly, it's tempting to bid up cash rent. Be cautious of doing that. when you're doing that, you're tying up a lot of capital. And so you're a relatively new producer. You really need to pencil out how much cash rent I can afford, and stop bidding if it looks like you're getting way over your head in terms of a cash rent above your break even. I know that's challenging to do what I talked about there, but you really have to do your homework on break even cash rent, because you can't afford to pay very much. We're an established farm with strong balance sheet. You don't want to do it, but if they pay a little higher cash rent for 1 or 2 years, it's not going to break them.
Really good advice there. I think that doing your homework piece is really important. It also helps establish your credibility as a good person to
Yes.
rent to, that you know what
Yeah.
you're doing and you're taking your business seriously.
And
So really
it
great
probably
advice
doesn't
there.
need to be said, because we got Farm Credit that are talking to these people, and banks in general. Get crop insurance. Do your homework on crop insurance. Make sure that you have that ground insured at a decent coverage level. Again, you're asking around. You can see what other people are doing. Talking to your crop insurance agent, you can see what other people are doing in the area. But do your homework with crop insurance too, because that helps you provide that safety net. Even if you're doing a share lease, that crop insurance can really help. Make sure that income doesn't drop too low.
100%. We will never not want to shout out about crop insurance.
Yes.
Definitely important. All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time here. So I want to thank you, Dr. Langemeier, for taking time today and answering all the questions. I want to thank you, everyone in the audience today. Really great questions. Do take a moment to check out that quick survey as you exit the webinar. Your feedback does help us plan future topics here. We will be back on September 6th. And for that webinar, we'll be talking about farm insurance. So not really related to crop insurance, but also a very important topic. So we hope you'll join us on September 6th. Until then, we hope to see you again soon. Thanks.